So obviously around this time of year, we have to create something Christmassy with CSS. And I've chosen to create a Christmas tree with CSS. It is very, very straightforward, but as you can see, the resemblance to a real tree is uncanny. This doesn't take long at all. It's just a little bit of fun, and we're obviously going to be doing this with pure CSS rather than using an image. So let's get going and build this Christmas tree with CSS. Alright, so we're starting off with not much at all. We've got a basic document layout here, and I've linked in this tree.css file, which lives in this CSS directory just here. And we're going to start writing the markup. We're going to go over to our CSS file, change a few things, and then we'll start to add our layers and finally add the log at the bottom. So I'm going to create a div called with a class of tree just to contain all of this, and then for each layer, we're going to have a div with a class of tree layer. So over in tree.css then, we're going to define a width for our tree. So we're going to say we want a width of 120 pixel. You can obviously go ahead and adjust the measurements later on to make this a little bit bigger if you wanted to. But what we want to do now is for the first tree layer, we're going to create a triangle with CSS. And this is fairly straightforward, because all really this tree is built up of is triangles and then a square at the bottom, which is pretty straightforward. So for the first tree layer then, we're going to give this a width of 0, and we're going to give this a height of 0 as well. So to create a triangle, we set a transparent border on the two sides that we don't want to be the point, and then on the opposite side, we set a larger colored border, and that will point through and create our point. So remember we want a point at the top of the tree, so we want to add a large bottom border. If none of this makes sense, that's absolutely fine. It's very hacky. So let's create our left border first of all. That's going to be 40 pixels. It's obviously going to be solid and it will be transparent. And we do the same for the right border as well. So these are the two sides that we want to be pointing upwards, so left and the right. So now we're going to add a border bottom, slightly larger, obviously make this solid, and we're going to choose a color. So I'm just going to say green. So if we take a look at this in the browser, we now have the top of our tree. Really straightforward. So remember, the left and the right are transparent, and then we have the bottom border point up to create this point. Okay, so what we now want to do is create subsequent tree layers, and we're going to be using the nth child selector in CSS to do this, and then we'll just number each layer. And this makes a little bit of duplication, but it means that we can just add layers as we need. So let's duplicate this and start on our next layer. So we're going to say tree layer, we're going to say nth child, and then we're going to choose the number 2 here. It's our second child. And we're going to go ahead and just change the border left width. So basically all this means is that we're inheriting the styles from this, but we're just changing the border left width for this particular element. Just makes it a little bit easier. Although there is some repetition, it's better than copying and pasting this class and saying tree layer 1, tree layer 2, etc. So the border left width is going to be increased. Remember, that's the transparent border. And we're also going to increase the width of the border right as well. And then obviously what we want to do is increase the border on the bottom so it's a lot larger. So we have a border bottom width, and we're going to set that to something like 80 pixels. You can fiddle around with these values to get the shape and the size of your tree as you want, but for now I've just created these as equal as possible. So we've now got a couple of problems. The first one is that these aren't aligned. We want these to be all nicely aligned in the middle. If we just inspect this element here, this tree element, we know it's a specific width, and each of these tree layers sat in here. But what we need to do is we need to center these layers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say tree layer, and I'm going to set the margin to 0 auto. The reason I've created a separate selector here is what we also need to do is we need to center the tree log as well, which we haven't created yet, but we'll put the selector in there just so we don't forget. So now we have the following. They are now nicely aligned up through the center. But the Christmas tree is not looking great because this needs to push up a little bit. So let's go ahead and do that now. All we need to do for this is set the margin top to a negative value. So in this case, we'll say something like minus 30 pixels. So that's going to push this up minus 30 pixels. And now we have the first 2 layers of our tree. So it's starting to look really cool. Okay, so now we want to duplicate this down for a 3rd layer. And we can just copy and paste this selector here and just change the nth child to the 3rd child and then start to play around with some of these values. So we'll get rid of the margin top just so we can add that in a bit later. Again, I'm going to increase the left width and the right width, making sure that they're the same. And then I'm going to increase the bottom width as well. So now we have our last layer of our tree. And again, we'll go ahead and add back in this margin top property. And this is going to be just a minus value. So we can say something like minus 50, and that pushes that up. So our tree is complete, but what's a tree without a log at the bottom to hold it up? We need to go ahead and create this now. So let's go ahead and create the markup. We'll just duplicate this down and change this to tree log. And we'll go ahead and create a selector for this. And the tree log, we're going to set maybe 20 pixels in width, maybe 30 pixels in height. You can obviously change this to whatever you think is necessary. And then we have a background color, and I'm going to choose the CSS named color saddle brown. It's quite a nice brown. So now that we've got this, we can go ahead and preview it. And there we go. There's the log of our bottom. If you didn't add this selector in here, you're obviously going to get the following, which looks a bit odd. So make sure you are centering the log as well. And there is our CSS Christmas tree.